Now I want to continue with the early days of my great-grandfather and my grandfather, beginning in the spring of 1834 when they applied for their passport application. As I mentioned, I don't have a lot of personal information about my great-grandfather, or grandmother for that matter, but I do have the genealogy of the whole family dating back to 1625 that I've managed to resurrect. And I know that great-grandpa had 7 kids. The first one was Margaret Melaine, and she was born in France in 1831. I don't know when she died. I couldn't find that information when I was doing the research. The second one was Francois Margaret. She was born also in France in 1833 and died in 1907. And the one born in 1831 was probably the one that died on the water coming over. My grandfather was born June 25th, 1835, and conceived in the early fall of 1934. Of course, he wasn't on the original passport application, and no matter how you look at it, whether they were able to embark on the fall departure or the spring departure, my great-grandmother was pregnant during the voyage. So there's no way of knowing actually whether he was born on the water or immediately upon their arrival here. No data confirms the survival of the oldest daughter. The next child was Amo, and he was born in 1837, a couple of years after they arrived here. Then Louise was born in 1837 also. Apparently Amo was born early in the year and Louise later in that same year. I don't have their birth date, so I can only assume that that's what's possible. August then was the next boy, and he was born in 1841. He died in 1913. And then another girl, Lafayette, was born in 1843 and died in 1878. So those are the children that were born to my great-grandfather. Of course, my grandfather was the first one born in this country of that family. When I was young, I used to root through the unfinished room upstairs that was used as an attic and a storage place for various miscellaneous stuff that Mom and Dad had. And one day I found a pistol that had been through a fire, and I asked my dad about it, and he told me that it had been in the house when the house burned down in 1922. But it was a pistol that had been carried by my great-grandfather on a trip to Texas. This story has been corroborated by my Uncle Lawrence many years after Dad told me this. One time I was visiting Uncle Lawrence and I asked him about this, and he remembered very clearly the story, and I cassette taped it in its full length. So as strange as it may sound, it's apparently true, but it's the only evidence I have that actually happened. So he proceeded to tell me the story of a great-grandpa and a friend who had heard about land in Texas, and apparently they had some dissatisfaction with the struggle there in Pennsylvania. And I'm assuming this is around the 1840s or early 1850s because of the political events that were happening in Texas on their second trip. But nevertheless, they decided to walk to Texas after the spring planting and stake a claim if they found it satisfactory. My dad told me that on their way down, they apparently went through Georgia and were captured by Indians. The Indians weren't hostile, but they kept them there for a day or two, I guess, or released them in good health. And they continued then on down to Texas, and I have no details of what they did when they arrived there, but apparently they found land that was available and they liked it, so they put out their stakes and recorded it as theirs with the proper people. Then they walked back, 3,000-mile round trip at least. Today's Google map records it as about 1,500 if you go near Dallas, which I'm assuming they went to some approximate place in Texas. So the next spring then they repeated the process, only this time my Uncle Lawrence said they went through Houston. But anyway, when they arrived at their staked out location, they found that the stakes had been removed and others had claimed the land, and that there was a lot of turmoil, a lot of fighting and military activity in the area. During that time frame, there was a lot of hostility between the United States and Mexico. And of course, Mexico owned a good part of Texas and Arizona and California during those years. Much to their disappointment, they couldn't exercise their prior claim, and with the turmoil there, they decided that they were better off in Pennsylvania, and so they made the long 1,500-mile or so walk back home and never exercised any more activity about it. I suspect they were greatly disappointed in the effort to walk those 6,000 miles and not have anything to show for it. Must have been pretty disheartening. Another story I have about great-grandpa, and I can't verify the timing or even the accuracy of it. The details are really pretty sketchy. But enough people, my dad and my uncle, basically, that told me this story that it's hard to discount it. Anyway, I'm going to tell it, include it with this stuff. But the story goes that the great-grandpa had been here for a while. My guess would be about 25 years, which would make it around 1860 or something of that nature. Anyway, the story goes that there was a woman that lived here that wanted to go back to France and die. She apparently had some kind of disease, possibly cancer or whatever, but she wanted to die in her homeland, at home. So great-grandpa took her back to France, and while he was there, he looked up his half-brother, Pierre. Pierre and he were close when they were young and still in France, and was successful in finding Pierre. It seems that Pierre was extremely poor and living in a very small hut somewhere around Rougeux or Pierrefittes. Great-grandpa went to his house and knocked on the door, but Pierre wouldn't answer. My great-grandpa kept pounding on the door, and finally Pierre came to the door, and he recognized my great-grandpa and broke into tears. They had quite a reunion apparently, but the reason he wouldn't answer the door is because there were so many beggars and Pierre didn't have anything to give him, and so he just refused to answer the door. Apparently Pierre was an older man then too. That's the gist of the story. I have no idea how long he was there or any more details, but it would be quite a feat to return to France. Although by 1860 or so, transportation across the Atlantic was vastly different than it was in the 1830s. I don't have a lot of information about my grandfather or mother either, for that matter. My dad told me several stories that he had heard from his father, but I never inquired either. I could have gotten more from him, because certainly I sure bet that he knew something more about his father or his grandfather than the couple of 2 or 3 things that he mentioned over the years that we were together. I didn't know much about him either, and except for his logbooks and so forth. We never talked very much about things like that. We really never had a close man-to-man, birds-and-the-bees conversation, that's for sure. One story that Dad told me his grandfather told him was that Napoleon lost the battle at Waterloo because his soldiers gave up on him. Some of that may be true, but having read a fair amount of history, a lot more issues than that involved with it. For example, at Waterloo, if the Prussians hadn't arrived at just a wrong time and given support to the English would have been thoroughly beaten. But Blucher, his army, turned the tide, and Napoleon didn't have a chance. But his army had been suffering for quite a few years of endless warfare and the Russian disaster and so forth. It certainly lends some basis for believing that they were thoroughly sick of being led to slaughter endlessly for really little purpose and certainly no personal gain for them. Apparently Grandpa Rougeux was a very powerful man. He could lift a plow, and I know how heavy those things are because I used them when I was a kid at home. But apparently he could lift this plow by himself from the ground up to the bed of the wagon, which was probably 3.5, 4 feet. Another story that Dad told me was about a fight that Grandpa had with a bully that apparently had a reputation around there for dominating whoever he was with. But apparently there was a picnic or a party or something at a home in Frenchville whose owner was named Janet. And apparently there was quite a crowd there, and they were drinking hard cider, which is cider that's fermented and gained a certain percentage of alcohol. I've tasted hard cider myself when I was young, but I don't think the percentage was very high. Perhaps the level maybe beer. But with adequate quantities, the desired effect could be attained. So apparently this bully was fortified with enough hard cider to challenge my grandfather. And as the story goes, as Dad told it, Grandpa was very patient with him. Grandpa wasn't a bully and a fighter, but this guy hurt Grandpa to the point where Grandpa gave him a right hook right on the mouth. And apparently this guy had a pipe in his mouth at the time, and the pipe and mouth and lips and teeth all got united in one foaming mess, and knocked him out colder than a cucumber. So my grandfather was a tough old bird. And if you look at his picture here, I think you'll agree that he doesn't look like a patsy, and you might want to think twice before you cross him. And certainly he worked hard all his life, and he was, even at the age this picture shows, he looks like a tough old bird. In 1913, there was a barn raising at Ginnow's, which was down along Sandy Creek, about a mile from Grandpa's home there. These pictures show the construction of this barn. Those timbers were all cut and hewn and measured to the right dimensions and so forth, well before the barn raising party. And when all those beams were ready for assembly, the neighborhood guys and wives all came, and in a day they erected this barn. Certainly one man couldn't do it, and with a whole crowd it made the job much swifter and lighter. These pictures show my dad and his cousin Jerome and others that were there that day. But the picture I want to talk about more is the group photo in front of the wall of the house. The house was built on the side of a hill, and this was the basement wall, and these people were gathered there, including the women who had worked on the barn during the day. The women did the cooking and feeding of the crew, and of course the men all worked diligently to get the job done. My grandfather's in the lower left corner of the photo, and from this photo it's difficult to see any real details, but I chopped this section out of the photo and enlarged it, and I could see a couple of things that I didn't realize. He was wearing glasses, and he was smoking a pipe. The pipe was not very clear, and I enhanced it with some electronic juice. But I also noticed that he was probably wearing a bearskin or a sealskin hat. And if you look at his grizzled old face, you can affirm the decision that he was, at 78, he's still a strong man. He lived to be 92, so he still had a few years ahead of him there. I don't know who built the house shown in this picture. I don't know whether it was Grandpa or Great-Grandpa, but either case, it was an attractive house. The gutters and eaves were trimmed with hand-cut scroll, trimmed, and as you can see from this picture of the front porch, a lot of manual effort went into purely superfluous decorations. Had the funds to do it. I suspect the house was built like the rest of them around that era of time, and they were built with planks, later for crisscross with vertical planks, and then crossed horizontally with another layer of planks, and then covered with a milled cove board. In the neighborhood, there are still at least 3 houses that I know of that were built of logs and then eventually covered over with with milled clapboard siding, and those are still standing. One still remains on the sheet. Balloon type construction as used today didn't begin until the 20s sometime. Well, that type of construction was also used on the replacement house where I was raised and lived after 1929. That type of construction was totally uninsulated and bitter cold in the winter and blistering in the summertime. Interior walls were finished with, at least in the house where I was raised, with a layer of a thin cardboard, perhaps an eighth of an inch thick or so, and then wallpaper was glued over the top of that. So it looked attractive enough with the wallpaper, but it didn't offer any protection from the elements to speak of. Of course, there weren't any facilities in the house. There wasn't any interior plumbing or electricity or anything like that. The house was built without closets, too. My grandparents' first child was Fred. He was born in 1866. And they had 14. They lost one in infancy. By the time of Fred's birth, I think that a good portion of the fields had been cleared, although I don't think that it was finished by any means. But as the children came along, they all worked on the farm at an early age. My dad only went to the third grade because he was needed on the farm, and my grandfather couldn't spare him. But my father was one of the youngest ones. And so these older boys and gals who worked in the house and the garden and did the milking and so forth, plenty to do without working in the fields. But anyway, the older boys then all worked in the fields, planting and harvesting crops. And in the winter they worked in the woods, cutting trees and skinning them to the river. So they had a year-round job, without mercy, that's for sure. But as the years rolled by, events were interfering with this not so idyllic life. Grandma and Grandpa had a number of serious vicissitudes during their lifetimes, as most of us have, but these are really major events, and I'm going to recite those in the next few minutes of this video. First tragedy was the loss of their 5-year-old son, Charles, in 1878. He died of some illness that Dad couldn't remember. Dad told me that in the fall of 1894, they were sitting on the front porch of the house and enjoying a thunderstorm. In those days, and even while I was a kid, the thunderstorms seemed to be pretty fierce around there, and many times I've seen lightning strikes on the lightning arresters on top of the barn roof, and seeing balls of fire run down the side of the conducting wire to the ground. And so, and in those days too, amusements were few and far between, and so watching a thunderstorm was the form of TV or whatever in those days. But nevertheless, it was a nice warm evening, and they were sitting on the front porch, a group of them, sons and parents probably. But during one of the lightning flashes, they noticed what they thought was somebody running across the field below the barn. And it wasn't but a few minutes later when flames leaped out of the cracks between the boards on the side of the barn, indicating that the haymow on the house side was already in flames. And of course the barn was doomed because there wasn't any fire department nearby, and it would have been far too late anyway, because the straw and the hay in the haymows, and since it was fall, those mows were full, really flammable materials, and so any fires in the barn immediately doomed it. They immediately ran up to the barn and got the horses and the cattle out of it, and a couple of pieces of harness and so forth, but the upper part of the barn was already totally engulfed. They, of course, were horrified at the loss of the fall crops, and the harnesses and the other machinery that was parked on the barn floor, wagons and so forth, all went up in flames. It turned out that further investigation discovered that 7 other barns had burned in the area within the past few months. Those fires were also investigated, and it focused on the neighbor woman over the hill to the south. a family by the name of Plubel who lived in a log cabin, and they had a barn that had burned too. The investigators found that Mrs. Plubel was basically insane, and that she had gone around and ignited these barns, including her own. There wasn't any way to punish her other than put her in an insane asylum, which existed in those days for people who had serious mental deficiencies. But of course there wasn't insurance either, and they were without food for the cattle for the winter, and of course the loss of the equipment was also a serious loss, without mentioning the cost of the barn. But they gathered their wits and resources together and rebuilt the barn in the typical fashion, with the barn raising and so forth. But it was a terrible loss, and it must have been really disheartening, to say the least, to see the whole year's efforts go up in smoke. The next major loss was Uncle Gus. Uncle Gus died in 1913, and he died from an unknown or very ill-defined illness. Dad said he thought he had some kind of an arthritic problem or something, but I don't know. But nevertheless, he died and left a family. Then in 1916, the next catastrophe happened with the death of Fred, their oldest one. He was a telegraph operator along with his brother Lawrence and Guy, and my father, and Alfred, and others that populated the numerous offices along the railroad tracks. These were small little buildings, maybe 12 feet square, situated every mile or so along the tracks to control the trains via the telegraph system. These offices were built on a steep bank with the back edge usually overhanging the river and only a few feet away from the rails themselves. But this telegraph system was operated by batteries, since this was prior to the distribution of electrical systems throughout the country. And these batteries were in each office. And these batteries were large glass jars, clear glass, about 2 feet high and maybe 15 inches square or something like that. And they held electrolytes, and the water evaporated from the battery as they do, and had to be replaced periodically. And this was done by the operator, who was responsible for maintaining the batteries. So one day the batteries required replacement in his office, so he got water and filled them, but in the process he apparently got acid on his hands. And of course there wasn't any bathroom or sinks or running water at those places, so he didn't normally wash his hands after that. As a matter of course, he'd had to go down to the river to do that. But anyway, when he completed that, he went to the outhouse down the tracks a little way that served as a place for relieving himself. And during this process of wiping his anus, he apparently touched his skin with the acid on his fingers, and before long he had an infection there that led either to gangrene or some terrible infection that took his life. And he had a slow, painful death as a result. But this was a major loss because he had 5 children, and of course they were still in their young ages. Then again, another catastrophe in 1919. Albert, the youngest one, had been in France during the war, and he had been discharged and returned home. But during the years 1917 to 1920, maybe before it ended, Spanish flu epidemic spread throughout the world and killed over 60 million people. In fact, my mother said that every other house on her block had a death in it during that time. But nevertheless, Albert contracted the flu, and he died, and he left 2 small children. One of the grandchildren lives in my neighborhood. Larry Duke's his name, and we recently become reacquainted. But I have a photo here that shows my father in his army uniform home on leave for the funeral, and he's holding Albert's two little girls, and the one on the left is the grandmother of my neighbor. Then in 1922, my grandmother, Lucille, died. And as a result of her death, Grandpa was left alone there in the house. So for whatever reason, my Uncle Hector and his 7 children moved in to that house with Grandpa. And of course there was no electricity, and the lighting system was a kerosene lamp, common in use in our own family until 1939 when we got electricity. So during my childhood, the same type of lamp was used for lighting in the house. This, the house there before it burned, it was a 2-story house, and it had a bathroom on the 2nd floor. I mentioned before there was a 1,000-gallon tank under the back porch, and every morning the little 1-horsepower hit and miss gasoline engine was fired up, and the tank pressurized so that water would flow during the day. And one of the children of Hector, I don't know whether it was a male or female, was upstairs in the bathroom with a kerosene lamp and accidentally knocked it over and broke it, and the kerosene spilled out on the floor of the bathroom. Well, this house was already 50 or 60 years old and dried out and caught on fire immediately. But instead of calling for help or taking some proactive measures to put the fire out, this child ran out of the bathroom and closed the door and went outside of the house. And by the time it was noticed, a hopeless effort to try to save anything. The only thing that was saved was a picture of my grandmother taken in 1915 at her and my grandfather's golden wedding anniversary. And my dad said that Grandpa grabbed it off the wall as he ran out of the house. But anyway, all the antiques, the beautiful piano and organ and that they had, and everything, my dad's World War I uniforms and so forth that he had stored in the attic, everything was gone. But at least Grandma didn't have to see the house burn down. That's one consolation of that. Then in 1927, Grandpa died, and I'm going to read the obituary. The late J.B. Rougeux, pioneer lumberman. That's the headline. Run hundreds of rafts down the Susquehanna, and boyhood drove ox teams through Phillipsburg to Tyrone for provisions when the country was a wilderness. John B. Rougeux, whose death on Monday morning, November 7th, 1927, at the home of his daughter, Mrs. Ida Hoover, at Morrisdale, was briefly noted in our columns, was one of the oldest native residents of Clearfield County. This deceased was born at Frenchville on June 30th, 1895. That's not been proven, but that's a conjecture that's reasonable too. In age 92 years, 4 months, and 8 days. Practically all his life was spent in this community in which he was born. He followed lumbering and farming all his life. He was an expert riverman, and years ago ran hundreds of board and timber rafts down the Susquehanna River to Williamsport and Marietta. And before railroads were built in this section of the county, would have walked all the way back home. And that would have been about 100 miles over the mountains. In pioneer days, when only a boy, he would drive a team of oxen to Tyrone for provisions, that town being the closest marketing place. About 40 miles each way. With the exception of a few fields and a small number of houses in Phillipsburg and different places along the route, the whole distance was a vast region of forest, timber, and virgin growth. He took great interest in the progress of civilization and often compared the present mode of traveling to the ancient ox cart methods. He was a member of St. Mary's Catholic Church at Frenchville all his life and remained faithful to his creed to the last. He was one of the sturdy, honest, substantial type of men who have the respect of the community while they live and are sincerely mourned when they perish. On May 17, 1868, he was married to Lucy Mignot, who preceded him to the grave on December 2nd, 1922. To this union, 14 children were born, 10 of whom are still living, as follows: Ed of Williamsport, Hector of Clearfield, Frank and Mrs. Guterham of Ohio, Jewel and Charles, both live in Frenchville, Mrs. John Hoover, Helen and Guy of Morrisdale, and Lawrence of Driftwood. The funeral, in charge of his pastor, Reverend Father McGovern, took place from St. Mary's Catholic Church, Frenchville, on Wednesday morning, November 9th, was buried in the adjacent cemetery. In all the hours of research that I've done, and it's been many, I have not been able to find much about any personal attributes or conversations with my grandfather or my grandmother. It seems that all those that were associated or old enough then to talk to my grandparents are dead or didn't have much contact with them. So I was disappointed in not knowing some personal foibles or just something more about them. But I did find out that she was 18 and he was 30 when they got married. I did find a few things that were interesting. I found that he did loan money to his worthless nephew that was always in trouble financially. I know he gave money to the church. I know he helped construct a church there in Frenchville, which was a decade-long project. I'm not even sure that Grandpa could write. I suspect that he didn't speak English, because there wouldn't be any reason for him to learn during his lifetime, because he was surrounded by French-speaking people. And I know he got his faith from his father. When they came over from France into that wilderness, there weren't any priests or anything there, or any church. So, and of course their ability to bring anything very much was extremely limited. But one thing they did bring was some song sheets from the church there in Rougeux, and the people in the neighborhood would gather on Sundays at various houses and use those song sheets to sing and have a little worship session between the annual visits of a priest or someone from Baltimore, where the diocese was located. But I'll talk more about that later. But that's not what I was looking for, basically. But in any case, that's the typical story of people. Even famous people are soon forgotten, and as we will be. I hope I'm worth the same kind of epitaph that Grandpa had when he died. Well, I think this is a good place to stop this one, and we'll go to the next one.